In the late summer of 1942, the war in the Pacific balanced on a narrow strip of jungle and coral few Americans could find on a map. Guadalcanal was not a prize of culture or commerce. It had no cities, no industry, no population worth conquering. But in August of that year, this humid, disease-ridden island became the place where two visions of modern warfare collided for the first time, and where one of them broke. When Japanese planners had pushed south in early 1942, their momentum seemed unstoppable. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, each fell in rapid succession. The Imperial Army had perfected a way of war built on speed, aggression, and psychological shock. Night attacks, infiltration, bayonet charges, and an unshakable belief in moral superiority had carried Japanese forces from victory to victory. Against Chinese armies and colonial garrisons, it had worked. Against the Americans, Japanese commanders believed it would work again. Guadalcanal was supposed to be routine, a defensive outpost at the edge of Japan's expanding perimeter. When American Marines landed there on August 7, 1942, they were expected to be crushed quickly, before they could dig in, before they could bring their industrial power to bear. The first Japanese unit ordered to retake the island reflected this confidence. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki commanded a detachment of elite infantry, veterans hardened by years of fighting in China. He believed deeply in the doctrine that had shaped his career, that superior spirit and aggressive action could overcome any enemy advantage. Intelligence reports told him the Americans were few, inexperienced, and complacent. Ichiki did not wait for reinforcements. He did not pause to reassess. He moved immediately to attack. What he encountered on the banks of the Tanaru River shattered every assumption he held. The Marines waiting there had not come to Guadalcanal expecting an easy fight. Their landing had been chaotic, their supply situation precarious, their position exposed. But they had time, just enough time to prepare. They dug in along the sandbar where jungle met open ground. They emplaced machine guns not for glory, but for geometry, overlapping arcs of fire, designed to leave no safe path forward. Mortars were registered. Artillery coordinates were plotted. The Americans did not plan to charge. They planned to wait. When Ichiki's men attacked in the darkness before dawn on August 21st, they charged exactly as doctrine demanded, straight into the killing zone. Screaming battle cries echoed across the sandbar as Japanese soldiers advanced with bayonets fixed, convinced that shock and courage would break the defenders. Instead, they met sustained, methodical fire. American machine guns did not roar briefly and fall silent. They fired continuously. Water-cooled barrels allowed them to maintain a relentless tempo that Japanese infantry had never faced. Each burst was controlled, deliberate, fed by ammunition stocks that seemed inexhaustible. When attackers reached the far bank, they encountered canister fire from anti-tank guns that swept the ground clean. There was no collapse, no panic, no retreat by the defenders. The line held. By sunrise, hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead along the river. Ichiki's command had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans suffered comparatively minor losses. The imbalance was so extreme that survivors struggled to comprehend it. This was not defeat, as the Japanese army understood it. It was destruction. The shock of Tanaru did not end the battle for Guadalcanal. It merely began it. Japanese naval forces struck back almost immediately, ambushing Allied cruisers off Savo Island and inflicting one of the worst defeats in U.S. Navy history. In a single night, 4 heavy cruisers were sunk. The Marines on Guadalcanal were left isolated, short of supplies, and exposed. On paper, this should have reversed the situation. In practice, it changed nothing that mattered, because Henderson Field remained in American hands. The captured airstrip, hurriedly completed and brought into operation, transformed the campaign. Aircraft based there could dominate the surrounding seas by day, attacking any Japanese ship that ventured too close. Japan could reinforce only under cover of darkness, using fast destroyers in risky nighttime runs that became known as the Tokyo Express. Men could be delivered, heavy equipment could not. This logistical reality defined everything that followed. Japanese commanders continued to believe that one decisive blow could retake the airfield. They committed more troops, planning night attacks through jungle terrain they believed favored their style of warfare. What they did not fully grasp was that the Americans had learned from Tenaru and were preparing again. In September, Japanese forces struck south of the airfield along a narrow jungle ridge. It was the approach route any competent staff officer would choose, and American intelligence had already identified it as the most dangerous axis. Marines occupied the ridge in advance, digging in along its spine. Machine guns were positioned to sweep ravines. Mortars were set to cover likely avenues of approach. Artillery batteries inland plotted fire missions so close that friendly casualties would be inevitable, but acceptable. When Japanese troops attacked along the ridge at night, they found Marines waiting in prepared positions, supported by an integrated system of firepower. Infiltration attempts were broken by pre-registered artillery, massed assaults dissolved under machine gun fire. Individual Marines fought hand-to-hand when necessary, but the battle was decided not by blades, but by coordination. By dawn, the ridge, soon known as Bloody Ridge, was littered with Japanese dead. Once again, courage had met a system designed to destroy it. For Japanese soldiers who survived these battles, the realization was devastating. The Americans did not fight as expected. They did not flee under night attack. They did not exhaust their ammunition. Their weapons did not fail. Their wounded were evacuated, treated, and returned. Every engagement revealed the same truth. The enemy's strength did not lie in individual bravery, but in an industrial machine that fed the battlefield continuously. As the campaign dragged on, the environment itself became a weapon. Guadalcanal's heat and humidity bred disease at a terrifying rate. Malaria, dysentery, and infection ravaged both sides. But here, too, the imbalance was decisive. American supply lines, protected by air power, delivered medicine, food, and replacements. Japanese troops, dependent on destroyer runs and foraging, began to starve. Men fought on reduced rations, then on almost nothing at all. Ammunition was hoarded. Wounds that would have been survivable became fatal. Entire units weakened before they ever reached the front. Diaries recovered later spoke of soldiers eating grass, bark, and insects. Disease spread unchecked. Combat effectiveness collapsed. Yet Japanese command persisted, launching one final major offensive in October. Thousands of troops attacked American lines south of Henderson Field, supported by what little artillery could be brought ashore. They fought with determination and discipline, pressing attacks through the night. They were met again by artillery barrages, coordinated machine gun fire, and immediate counterattacks. By dawn, the offensive was broken. The cost was catastrophic. After that, Guadalcanal was no longer a battle of maneuver, it was a slow collapse. Naval defeats prevented meaningful reinforcement. Air losses mounted. Starvation spread. By November, Japanese leaders privately acknowledged what they could not admit publicly. The campaign was lost. The only remaining objective was evacuation. In early 1943, under the cover of darkness, Japanese destroyers pulled thousands of surviving soldiers off the island. They left behind tens of thousands of dead victims, not only of American firepower, but of a war their nation was never equipped to sustain. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the moment. Illusion gave way to reality. The belief that spirit could overcome material disadvantage had failed against an enemy fighting an industrial war. For the Americans, the campaign proved something equally important, that they could endure, adapt, and defeat a skilled and determined opponent under the worst conditions imaginable. The jungle of Guadalcanal did not simply consume men, it revealed the future of the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japan would fight defensively, trading lives for time against an enemy whose systems never stopped functioning. Guadalcanal was where the momentum turned and where one way of war died. The American foothold on Guadalcanal should have collapsed in the second week. That was the logic in Tokyo. It was the logic aboard the Japanese cruisers sliding through the black water off Savo Island, and it was the logic whispered among Marines who watched the horizon, waiting for the next ship that might never come. On the night of August 8th into August 9th, the sea itself seemed to turn against the Americans. Japanese warships, moving with practiced confidence in darkness, struck the Allied screening force like a knife. Flares, searchlights, and gun flashes ripped open the night. In minutes, heavy shells began walking across Allied hulls. Cruisers burned from stem to stern. Men leapt into oil-slicked water as steel folded and ammunition cooked off. For the United States Navy, it was a humiliation that carried the sour taste of Pearl Harbor all over again. For the Marines ashore, it meant something more immediate: isolation. Transports withdrew. Cargo that should have been stacked behind the beach remained on ships or sank with them. Radios crackled with partial reports and rumors. Some Marines had rifles and little else. Many had no tents, no spare clothing, no mosquito nets. They were an expeditionary force stranded on an island they had just seized, staring into a jungle full of enemies and disease. If the Japanese had been able to sail in daylight and pour in supplies, artillery, and reinforcements, Guadalcanal might have ended right there. But they could not, because Henderson Field, unfinished, scarred with bulldozer tracks, and surrounded by kunai grass, began to wake up. The airstrip was more than a runway. It was a switch that turned the whole campaign on and off. Within days, American aircraft began landing, fighters and dive bombers arriving in dribs and drabs, their maintenance improvised under palm fronds, their crews sleeping in the dirt, their engines kept alive with scavenged parts and relentless labor. They called it the Cactus Air Force because Guadalcanal's code name was Cactus. The name sounded almost light-hearted. The work was not. Every morning, those pilots looked toward the sea and tried to read the weather, like scripture. If the sky was clear, the Japanese could not approach. If cloud and rain wrapped the island, the Tokyo Express might slip in, fast destroyers sprinting down the slot at night, unloading men and crates in a frenzy, then fleeing before dawn could bring American aircraft down on them. This was the cruel rhythm of Guadalcanal. Japan owned the night, America owned the day. And yet, even in the hours Japan controlled, the island refused to behave the way Japanese doctrine demanded. After Tenaru, Japanese command did not stop believing. It doubled down. Reinforcements began arriving without their heavy equipment. Batteries of artillery that might have softened American defenses had to be left behind. Trucks, spare parts, field kitchens, anything bulky became a liability. Soldiers came ashore carrying what they could on their backs. In the tropics, under constant pressure, that was not enough. Still, the Japanese planned a second decisive blow. This time it would not be an obvious charge across open sand. It would be an attack that matched their self-image: silent, skillful, deadly in darkness. They would come through the jungle to the high ground south of Henderson Field, slipping around the edges of the American perimeter and striking where the Marines were weakest. But the Marines were learning, and their intelligence, rough as it was, had begun to sense the shape of the threat. On patrols and raids, Marines found signs: abandoned rice sacks, ammunition boxes, fresh trails cut through foliage. Then came one of the most important scraps of information in the campaign: evidence of supply dumps and troop concentrations at a village called Tasimboko. It confirmed what Vandergrift's staff suspected. Something big was building in the jungle. A serious attempt to take the airfield was coming. The high ground that mattered was a thin, coral-backed ridge running like a spine through the grass. It was not impressive on a map, not a hill a European army would even name. But on Guadalcanal, it mattered because it was one of the few avenues the jungle allowed. Any force moving toward the airfield from the south would funnel toward that ridge, whether it intended to or not. So the Marines occupied it first. The defenders were not a full regiment. They were raiders, paratroopers, and whatever men could be spared. Units known for aggression, now tasked with doing the least glamorous thing in war: hold ground at night and refuse to be moved. They dug in along the ridge crest. They emplaced machine guns where they could rake the approaches. They stacked ammunition until their positions looked like supply depots. Forward observers memorized coordinates. Artillery batteries plotted their fires like surgeons planning an amputation. When the Japanese assault came on the night of September 12th, It arrived in fragments, small groups, probing, feeling for cracks. In the darkness, the ridge became a series of isolated fights. Rifle flashes shouted warnings, grenades arcing through the grass. A Marine might fire at a shadow 10 yards away and never know if he hit anything. Then, suddenly, the enemy would mass for a push, and the American response would shift from individual desperation to system. Mortars thumped. Artillery began to land with a flat, brutal rhythm. Machine guns opened in controlled bursts that cut down movement in the ravines. The ridge did not feel like a heroic last stand. It felt like a coordinated machine responding to pressure, tightening its grip. The Japanese came again the next night, more desperate, more concentrated. At points they nearly broke through. Marines fell back to tighter positions. Officers and NCOs moved along the line, forcing coherence out of exhaustion and fear. One machine gun section became a pivot point for the entire defense. When its crews were killed or wounded, a single Marine kept the weapon firing, hauling ammunition, fixing jams, refusing to let the ridge go quiet. Around him, the defense held, not by individual will alone, but by the fact that every rifle, gun, and shell was part of a larger pattern. By dawn, the ridge was still American. The ground in front of it was not. The Japanese had inflicted real casualties. Marines were dead and wounded in numbers that could not be dismissed. But the Japanese price was catastrophic, and more importantly, it was paid from a pool of strength Japan could not replenish. Guadalcanal was consuming experienced infantry faster than the Imperial Army could replace them, and it was doing so while the Americans were still building momentum. Now the campaign began to reveal its deeper truth. Guadalcanal was not a contest of bravery. It was a contest of endurance under a supply equation. American ships, once Henderson Field was secure enough, began arriving in daylight under the umbrella of friendly aircraft. Each delivery meant food, ammunition, medicine, and replacements. It meant that malaria could be treated, wounds could be cleaned, fevers could be lowered. It meant that machine guns could fire until their barrels were worn, then new barrels could be issued. It meant the system could keep functioning even when individuals broke down. Japanese destroyers could deliver men quickly, but they could not deliver the weight of modern war. Artillery shells, heavy rations, medical stores, those required transports, and transports required daylight approaches. And daylight approaches meant death from the sky. So Japanese soldiers began to shrink physically as they fought. Their uniforms hung loose, their faces hardened into angles, they carried fewer rounds. They conserved grenades. Their wounded were dragged into jungle shade and left there because there was nowhere to send them. The island began killing them even when the Marines were not. And yet, Tokyo and Rabaul continued to insist the airfield must be taken. By October, the Japanese assembled their largest effort yet. This time, they hoped mass and coordination could do what spirit alone could not. Attacks struck along the Matakau River and from the jungle south of the airfield. There were moments in those nights when the lines trembled, when the fighting compressed into close-range chaos and the outcome felt uncertain. But the pattern repeated. Whenever the Japanese concentrated, American firepower answered. Artillery landed so close that splinters cut Marines in their holes, yet the missions continued because they had to. Machine gunners fired until hands blistered and receivers burned. Runners and radio men kept the chain intact, turning individual positions into a single organism. By morning, Japanese assaults were broken again. The island had become a trap. Japan could not abandon it without admitting a turning point. But it could not win it without solving a problem it did not know how to solve. How to fight a modern combined arms enemy when the sea and air belonged to that enemy in daylight. Guadalcanal was no longer simply an island. It was a verdict forming in real time, a verdict on doctrine, on logistics, and on the belief that courage could substitute for supply. And as the rains returned and the jungle thickened, that verdict began to harden into something irreversible. By November, the campaign had crossed an invisible threshold. Up to that point, Japanese commanders could still imagine victory, if only the next convoy got through, if only one more attack succeeded, if only the Americans cracked under pressure or disease. But after months of failed offensives and mounting losses, Guadalcanal no longer looked like a battle that could be won. It looked like a wound that would not stop bleeding. The decisive moment came at sea. Japanese planners made one last attempt to break the stalemate by force of scale. If Henderson Field could not be taken by infantry alone, it would be neutralized by naval gunfire. Battleships would smash the airstrip, transports would land an entire fresh division with heavy equipment. Once ashore, overwhelming strength would finish the job. It was a gamble that demanded everything Japan still had in the region. The naval battles that followed in mid-November were among the most violent and confused surface actions ever fought. Ships blundered into each other at night. Searchlights snapped on and off. Radar contacts were misread. Commanders died on bridges as shells tore through steel at point-blank range. American and Japanese destroyers and cruisers traded blows at distances so close that crews could see faces across the water. The cost was appalling on both sides, but the result mattered more than the losses. Japanese bombardment missions failed. Henderson Field remained operational, and the transport convoy, 11 ships carrying men, artillery, vehicles, and supplies, was shattered by American aircraft and surface fire before it could unload. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died without ever reaching the front line. Equipment burned on the beaches. What little made it ashore was destroyed almost immediately. That failure ended the campaign in everything but name. After November, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were no longer an army in the field. They were isolated pockets of starving men clinging to jungle positions, hoping for orders that no longer made sense. Rations were cut again and again. Rice balls were divided into fractions. Medical care collapsed entirely. Men weakened to the point that they could not march, could not dig, sometimes could not even lift their rifles. American forces, by contrast, were growing stronger every week. Fresh army units arrived to reinforce the Marines. Artillery parks expanded. Air operations increased in scale and coordination. What had begun as a desperate foothold turned into a stable base for offensive action. The final American ground advance in January 1943 was not a dramatic breakthrough. It was a methodical sweep. Units advanced with artillery preparation, air support, and naval gunfire on call. Japanese resistance, when encountered, was fierce but fragmented. Many defenders fought until killed. Others were too weak to resist. Entire positions were found abandoned, the occupants dead from starvation or disease. In Tokyo and Rabaul, the truth could no longer be avoided. Guadalcanal could not be held. Continuing the fight would destroy what remained of the 17th Army for no strategic gain. The decision was made to evacuate, quietly, efficiently, and without public acknowledgement of defeat. In one of the most skillful operations Japan would conduct in the entire war, destroyers slipped in under cover of darkness in early February and pulled more than 10,000 survivors off the island. It was an extraordinary feat of seamanship and coordination, but it could not erase the meaning of what had happened. Guadalcanal had consumed Japan's offensive capability in the South Pacific. Of the roughly 36,000 Japanese troops committed to the campaign, the majority never left the island. Some were killed in combat. Many more died from hunger, malaria, and untreated wounds. Veterans who survived would later write that Guadalcanal was the moment they understood the war could not be won, not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, but because courage alone could not overcome a system designed to outproduce and outlast them. For the Americans, the victory carried different lessons. Guadalcanal proved that the Japanese could be beaten in sustained combat. It validated defensive doctrine built on firepower and preparation. It demonstrated that logistics were not a background function, but the foundation of combat power. Most of all, it showed that American industry, when connected to the battlefield, could translate potential into reality. The psychological impact was enormous on both sides. Japanese troops had entered the campaign believing themselves superior warriors facing an enemy they expected to break. They emerged shattered, haunted by the memory of machine guns that never stopped firing and artillery that answered every movement. American troops who had once feared Japanese night attacks as unstoppable learned that discipline, preparation, and coordination could blunt even the most determined assault. Guadalcanal did not end the Pacific War, but it ended the illusion that Japan could fight it on its own terms. From that point forward, the strategic initiative belonged to the Allies. The pattern established on Guadalcanal, air superiority, naval dominance, methodical ground operations, supported by overwhelming logistics, would repeat across the Pacific. Island by island, the same system would grind forward, exacting a terrible cost, but moving inexorably toward Japan itself. In the jungle, long after the guns fell silent, the wreckage remained. Rusting aircraft frames, shell craters, collapsed bunkers, and unmarked graves slowly disappeared under vines and rain. But, for those who fought there, Guadalcanal never faded. It was remembered as the place where fear changed sides, not because American soldiers were invincible, but because the machinery behind them was. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops learned that modern war was no longer decided by spirit alone. It was decided by supply lines, production schedules, integrated firepower, and systems that endured even when men fell. It was where reality replaced doctrine and where the Pacific War turned, not with a single blow, but with the steady pressure of an enemy that could not be exhausted. The jungle had delivered its verdict, and the war moved on.